My name is Prayag, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Marvin. We are a user research platform and a research repository. Unlike a few other tools, our software gets involved a lot earlier in the process, all the way from recruiting, recording, note-taking, analysis, sharing, reporting. If you would like to hear more, please go on ahead to www.heymarvin.com. And we are also on the Slack channel on the conference Slack. So find us there. But today, it's not about Marvin. I'm joined by one of our dear customers and partners, Abhinav. Abhinav is a design manager at Razorpay. For those of you who don't know, Razorpay, it's one of the highest funded startups in the world. It's one of the highest funded startups in India. They most recently raised a $375 million round at a $7.5 billion valuation. And one of the big reasons and what they're known for is the thoughtfulness of design that they put in. That's kind of one of the key things they're known for in the startup ecosystem, especially in the Indian startup ecosystem. And a lot of that is due to Abhinav. So Abhinav, love for you to introduce yourself and kind of share your story a little bit.
Hey Prag, nice to kind of meet you again. And I think very wrongly putting all the credit to my side because it's at the end of the day all a team effort, right? But yeah, just getting back to the point, like my name is Abhinav and I've been pretty much like in and out of like, let's say the product space and the design sort of space for the last 8-ish years now. I'm currently kind of like with Razorpay as a design manager taking, ownership of a particularly small and important chapter inside the business. And yeah, I mean, like, I think we'll probably get into the other details a little bit later.
Yeah, I think it's a good place. I think a lot of our participants today might not know about Razorpay because it's primarily used in India. So why don't we start with there? What does Razorpay do?
I think at the center of it, I think Razorpay started roughly around like 7 years ago right now. And I think with the primary vision of like, solving end-to-end financial stack for Indian businesses. And we're primarily a B2B facing company and we do not do any aspect of B2C. And I think at that point in time, I think also the Indian business ecosystem is like substantially different from like, let's say the rest of the world in terms of not only the number of segments that you have, but like, let's say the diversity of the segments themselves. And a common sort of problem point that we observed across like all the segments was just this ability or need to kind of optimize their cash flow and to kind of allow payments to just keep coming in. And I think at the same time, there were also some regulatory changes from the Indian government, which kind of offered the whole market this push to kind of switch from brick and mortar stores to kind of go online and take your business online, expand your reach, go D2C, right? So with that, I think we started off with the vision statement to help businesses collect their money faster and enhance their cash flow. And I think recently over the last couple of years, we've expanded that into like, let's say, hey, now that we are helping you kind of collect your money, let's also help you manage your money much better. And that is where I think we also have a neo banking suite to help businesses. But that's pretty much in its infancy right now. There are also a couple of, sorry, yeah, Brad.
Fantastic. I think one thing I know about Razorpay is it's the financial infrastructure for primarily small and medium-sized businesses in India. Today is kind of how I know it, and it seems like it's charter is expanding. The company is obviously expanding a lot, and as I mentioned, your company is known for pioneering a lot of amazing design. And your design practice is very well known in both the Indian startup ecosystem and in the startup ecosystem in general. And one of the things that really, you're a design manager. One of the things that stands out is that at Razorpay, a lot of research is done by designers.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, it is.
Tell me more about that. How did that come about? Why is that? How do you, how? Yeah, tell me more about how designers are doing most of the research at Razorpay.
Right. I think it primarily is a manifestation of two sort of like values that we have as a company. And one of
Hmm.
them is just we want to be able to give teams the ability to kind of be very autonomous with their decision making. And the
Hmm.
second, like sort of core principle that really allowed us in our very early stages to differentiate ourselves from, like, let's say the competition and sort of like, create a mode for us has always been that obsession with users and has always been uh, a lot more focus around experience in an area where it has been sorely missed, right?
Hmm.
So, as a manifestation of both of these sort of like cultural values, what eventually ended up happening is that, hey, if you're a person who's actually building a product for someone, if you're a person who's actually uh, building a service for someone, there's always a lot of context loss if, like, let's say the problem identification, understanding context and solutioning are being done by different sort of like, let's say, teams, right? And since we wanted to make teams be much more autonomous from an org structure POV, I think it just made a lot of sense for us. Uh, I think when we started off that, hey, our product managers and product designers together, in fact, it's definitely not just the designers, and it keeps changing with the team, with the sort of requirement and with the sort of like complexities of teams. But yeah, the core, like, let's say, product and design POCs of every sort of team are responsible for understanding the problem deeply enough so that they can be enabled to take decisions faster.
Got it. So this is actually fascinating to me because what you're essentially saying, and with this is kind of connects really nicely with the conversation I had with Hannah from Twilio that I had yesterday, and we're going to continue tomorrow. Um, is this idea that even within the core values, the user centricity is kind of part of the core value, and what that does is that basically as you grow, you tend to stay true to the value. You have to empower the broader team to not just empower, but in some way kind of encourage and even force them to be talking to users and doing research themselves. um, and that's really interesting. How does that blend into people's skills? So are you hiring, like, even your skills, right? Like, you are a classically trained designer, and you are now managing designers who you expect to be very research focused. So could you tell me a little bit about, you know how, before they even join you, are you hiring those people? What is your background? What are you trying to do to kind of make sure that the designers, even before they come to Razorpay, are capable to live up to your expectation of, like, hey, you need to be involved, not just involved, actually drive research?
Right. So I think that's a great question, Prayag, because that's something that we've ourselves seen, like a lot of like internal understanding just getting more and more mature over the past like 1.5 year. And I think I'll probably start off from myself. I was, yes, a very classically trained designer in the sense that I went to a
Mm-hmm.
design school, and then I started off my career at, like, let's say, design specializing service agency, and then worked with in a very process intensive sort of an environment. But I think over the years, both with the maturity of, like, let's say, the industry in general, and the moment more towards a product based, like, let's say, industry model, at the same time also going more and more into depth rather than just sheer breadth of like problems. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a fundamental switch in the industry as to what is required. Is it a focus on the process, or is it a focus on, like, let's say, the outcome? And this is, I think, an argument that we constantly hear at different places, right? But yeah, at least at, like, let's say, the infancy of the company at the scale which we were, like, let's say, for the last 3 years, for us it seemed like just first principle thinking and understanding of, like, let's say, the problem and the solution, and the rest of it is just like jargon or created sort of I would say vocabulary that does come in and add a lot of value when you're scaling, but at that
Mhm.
point in time, it didn't make a lot of sense to us. And one of the things that has been a core part of this in Razorpay was the fact that like a core part of our hiring process tests for this, and we heavily prefer candidates who who probably might not be able to kind of use the best vocabulary in terms of functions, etc., but who are able to think of problems from first principles, right?
Mhm.
And I think that coupled with the shortage of designers academically educated in India
Mhm.
has kind of given us this whole opportunity to kind of reach out to this whole segment of like first principle thinkers who haven't been classically trained. So they don't have
Mhm.
the traditional process education and vocabulary. So I think that's also been a great find for us.
Got it. Oh wow. So that actually again, we were talking about the session on how do you encourage and empower designers to do research. Just taking that to a little bit extreme. Or not. I guess it's working for you, so it's not extreme. It seems like the general thinking that I'm hearing a lot is, designers are expected in some way to be able to, do a lot of their own research, right? Like that's you're testing for that in even if they are not classically trained in research, they are expected to understand the basic principles of research and apply them you know and you're testing for it, and Hannah yesterday was talking about that she's testing for it. So that's a is that what you're saying, that you're actually testing for people to be like, hey, you better be at least have basic principles of research. Maybe you don't understand the jargon, maybe you don't understand kind of the more advanced research, but you should be able to at least do some of your own research.
Yeah, I think it counts in a little bit into that as well. And there's also
Mm-hmm.
this aspect of just like much more a higher quotient of self-awareness to a certain extent in
Mm-hmm.
terms of acknowledging the number of unknowns and
Mm-hmm.
being also humble enough to kind of acknowledge the number of unknowns. And
Mm-hmm.
that sort of a mindset is something that we've noticed helps a lot where like, once someone actually is a part of the team, there is a lot more open-ended questions that are identified, tackled, dealt with, discussed, and like, sort of closed. That helps
Mm-hmm.
the product in general be much more holistic.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a part of that as well.
Got it. So both in terms of you should have the intuitiveness to
Yeah.
know that research is required. So both kind of you should be intuitive enough to understand like, hey, I don't know, we don't know the answers, and not just I as a designer don't know the answers, we as a company don't know the answers, but then also have the skills to actually go ahead and try and find those answers by yourself. So that's begs a really important question in terms of, and I want to get into your process, because part of your process, I know it's not the whole process, part of the process is like just cold calling people for feedback, or calling people for feedback on the phone, which is amazing, which is the main a topic for of this talk. But before we even get into that, if you're hiring a lot of the designers and you're expecting a lot of them to do research, how do you build the scaffolding for to make sure that they're following the basic principles of research, that they're not introducing their own biases, they're following a process which someone like you laid out for the team? How do you make sure that scaffolding, that infrastructure is there?
And I think again, we're constantly evolving, and there's no straightforward answer to this. It has been evolving. We started off with like a format where we would ask designers, "Have you followed the process?" And that is where we started with like way ago. And now
Mm-hmm.
that has sort of evolved, and we've understood like across different sort of like business units, teams, and team structures, the same side, kind of scaffolding does not work. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've done is we've experimented with a bunch of different processes and artifacts that sort of really, instead of acting like a guideline, they rather act as a list of perspectives to sort of consider. Like as an example, I think obviously we have our own approach or like cut of like how we view design in terms of like how it can be applied into the typical product development life cycle. And we started off with a very abstracted philosophy around that. And that has given rise to a lot of artifacts that become a part of our process right now. For example, there's a list of uh, things that you need to check for, right? It's not necessarily things that you need to do, but it's a list that basically specifies these are the risks. Have you checked for if there is this kind of a risk in your particular product or your hypothesis, right? So we have some sort of a checklist. There's also some interesting aspects of most of these checks and balances being implemented into our communication processes, be it on our product management suite, be it on our, like, let's say, communication documents internally. I think a lot of them have these sort of like philosophies inbuilt and baked into them, which sort of like, acts as a constant reminder to our designers. Apart from that, you have the usual processes of, like, let's say, reviews, and you have the usual processes of like just being able to get together whenever you feel that there's an open question, and just being able to arrive at a faster decision.
Got it. That's fascinating, because I think what you're saying is, um, by the way, if you have questions, please post them in the Slack channel. I can see it here. I can also see it in the Slack channel. Because here we'll be able to answer the question, but if we'll lose the questions that are posted here on the Zoom chat. But we will Abhinav is in the chat on the AR sponsored Marvin. So if you post them here, Abhinav can also answer those questions later on. But if I understand correctly, what you're saying, Abhinav, is this idea that initially you started out with kind of built up processes that everybody was expected to follow, but then you realize that those kind of very kind of defined processes do not work across all the business unit. Obviously, you're much larger company now, and as the company evolved, those processes don't work. The one size fits all don't work. So they turned into, from processes to almost guidelines, to like, hey, have you thought about these questions while you're designing your study? And that transition meant that there was a lot more onus on the designers to follow kind of hey, here are to think for themselves.
Right, absolutely. Not only that, right, but we realized that the former approach that we were using is also not really helpful to, like, let's say, just the general growth of the team, because the core, I would say, focus should be on helping them take decisions better, rather than us getting involved or like helping them, or like, let's say, even hand holding them through decisions, which is not a scalable process for a very fast, like, I would say, growing organization like ours. And that is where I think the focus is just on enabling people to see more directions, see more perspectives, and think about what might be the possible risks over there. And then they have complete ownership on what they want to mitigate and how.
Got it. And you mentioned a checklist, and I think you mentioned kind of, what is on that checklist? Is it about bias? What are you asking people to check for?
Again, I think the checklist itself is probably at different levels in terms of like abstraction of thought. Like it starts from the very top in terms of like, hey, uh, have you have you even checked if this is an actual validated if this is an actual problem with the users, or like in what ways are the users currently solving this problem, and how is basically these are basics of product management, so as to speak, right? And how is your approach towards the solution going to be like radically different or adding more value to the user's life, right? It starts sort of from there. Then it goes into, like, let's say, just exploring the width of the problem statement itself, in terms of like how wide does it span, and like what are the different ways in which it can be interpreted by different sorts of personas, and things like that. And then it even boils down further into like very tactical things at one point in time, like, for example, what implications might this sort of a solution approach have on other products that are already a part of our ecosystem? What edge cases might it create? So that sort of a approach, mostly focusing on, like, let's say, clarity of first principles, then just like clarity in user stories, than like, let's
Mhm.
say, de-risking the solution approach itself.
Got it. So a lot of it seems like, is along the lines of think through the solution that you're proposing or the problems that you're exploring. Like think through it from not just your perspective, but the whole company's perspective. How about, are there checklists about how to go about asking questions?
Yeah.
Is does it go as tactical as that,
Yeah, I think
or
there are
what
some
questions to
tactical,
ask? Yeah.
yeah, there are some tactical, guidelines around that, but there are also like
Mhm,
bigger abstracted versions of, okay, you need to get this
mhm,
sort of an, insight from the user. Like for example, one of the examples earlier was in what way are users currently, solving for the same problem with like by any of their existing means, right? So that becomes
mhm,
like a way for us to ensure that our people are not really missing out on like, let's say, a perspective that already exists, and they're not really reinventing the wheel, so as to speak. So there are like a bunch of other like questions in that level. I think it falls in the first bucket, which is like the really abstracted bucket that focuses a lot more on the users. I think the
mhm,
second bucket just focuses a lot more on the context, and the third one
mhm,
focuses a lot more on just de-risking aspect of it. And the first bucket
mhm.
actually almost exclusively speaks to what you're talking about.
Got it. Okay. So the first bucket, more abstract out bucket, is all about how to, it almost seems like it tactically goes, or not tactically, it goes into how you are going to design the study, but instead of saying step one, do this, step two, do this, it's more around, have you thought about, what other solutions that users might be using? If not, here's a prompt to maybe ask them that. So that's that is a very different approach than what I thought you folks had. I was always thinking like, here is how you check your bias, here is how you ask a question, but instead it's more around, keep talking about the first principle. It's like, ask them, why should we even in some way check for biases, or how to do it in the context of the users themselves. um, that's real empowerment. That's something that I think is I would love I would love to hear, or at least like look at that checklist personally. That would be amazing to see, like, hey, how have you planned that out? um, and one of the things that this that you have been kind of using, one of the processes that you have been using, is what I thought was really interesting to hear for this crowd, because I don't see that very often. Is, you're doing the classic research, the Zoom, the Google Meet, kind of sometimes visiting customers, but a part of your research is also like cold calling people over the phone and doing like quick research that way. Could you talk a little bit about that part of your research?
I think the core need for this arises from like, let's say, two different like scenarios or two different factors. The
Okay.
first factor is that India as a market, and if we are saying that we're serving a lot of businesses in India, uh,
Hmm.
I think probably like 10-15% right now, with the support of the local government, etc., are sort of like tending to be more digital first. But
Hmm.
if you see, a majority of businesses are still not really internet ready, not really tech ready, and they don't even operate on calendars, they don't like do Zoom calls. There are people whose life mostly revolves around like, let's say, even constructing their business on WhatsApp, so as to speak, right?
Hmm.
So that's the persona of like a lot of businesses, just to get started with.
Hmm.
And even in terms of like, let's say, some of the core users that we are really reaching out to right now. One of them is this chartered accountant sort of a persona, who
Hmm.
again operate in a very unstructured way. Their operating model in general is still not like, let's say, the same way a startup in Silicon Valley operates. A lot of their
Hmm.
deals and a lot of their communication is done on the phone,
On the phone.
right?
Okay.
And I think this is one such avenue in which we found out that phones and dialing them directly was in fact the best way for us to kind of really start engaging with them. Of course,
Mhm,
how we engage with them is a different problem altogether.
mhm,
But in terms of after exploring a bunch of channels, we did email, we did like WhatsApp, we did the general like surveys and lots of other
mhm,
things. But uh, the general end users are not really used to these sort of like engagement over these sort of media,
mhm,
and that's where I think we just stuck to phones, right?
mhm.
And that sort of at least gave us some critical mass in terms of like let's say engagement with users and subsequently insights. The
So you're
second,
just, yeah, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry. Okay.
yeah.
Sorry
The
for that. Yeah.
second like avenue where I think this is needed is like let's say there's one part of it where you're calling your users, and there's
Mhm,
another part of it where you're actually wanting to understand the market, because of which I actually have to talk to people who are explicitly not my users, right?
mm,
And a lot of these calls are sort of set up by referrals or connections.
mhm.
And again, the same problem of like, let's say they might or might not be in a situation where they would be able to take a Zoom call because that requires preparation and setup, right?
Mhm.
And that is also another avenue where we found calls to be extremely useful, apart
Got it.
from like, let's say support and other things as well.
Got it. So you're basically, so sometimes it seems like sometimes these people are expecting your call, and other times it's a pure cold call. Is that
Yeah.
correct? Or are they, oh, wow.
Uh, yeah, I think sometimes it might be a cold call, and I think
Uh,
the way we're using that right now, uh,
mhm,
again, is in a way where we are indirectly informing the user.
mhm,
Like for example, whenever we get like a bad sort of a review on our NPS sort of metrics, then I think it's
mhm.
up to the product team to just pick up that dialer and call the person immediately, because one, it's better customer service, but
Right,
two, more importantly, we operate in a B2B space where most of our end users are like, founders who don't have time, right?
right,
And if they've
right.
actually sort of given us feedback, that's a hook for us to get the user engaged and then eventually get some value out of the conversation. So more
Got it.
often than not, I guess we are cold calling them, but like we inform them in the NPS survey itself that please expect a call soon enough.
Oh, got it. Okay. Um, so in this case, it's like product team is calling people to either get feedback, because these are people who might not, who don't live by their calendar.
Right,
It's an interrupt driven model. And
right,
some of them are people that just had bad experience, and your product team is trying to understand. So they'll just
right,
call you and say, "Hey, what could we have done better?"
right.
That is amazing. And so when you do these phone calls, like how do you set those up? Are you just, I mean, how long are, like, research sessions last like an hour, so I'm sure they probably can't spend an hour with you. Do you walk us through that part of the process a little bit?
Right. So are we talking exclusively about the phone calls or just like general any calls?
Well, in this case, just the phone calls, because that part is like really unique to what you folks do.
Right. I think there are certain like checks and balances there as well, because like I think the first approach we still would like to take is like a structured Zoom call, purely
Hmm.
because like, it gives us the opportunity to kind of record and just
Hmm.
look at how they're using our product more
Hmm.
importantly.
Hmm.
But oftentimes, especially with like let's say a lot of our target users, it might not work out that way. Alternatively, what happens is then we either just like set up a time and inform them, and we have sort of curated the selective set of users over WhatsApp. There is a dedicated
Hmm.
number over WhatsApp through which we interact, just the product team, not the support,
Hmm.
but the
Hmm.
product team interacts with users. And some sort of setup is done over that channel,
Hmm.
and when the time comes we dial them through like let's say the phone,
Hmm.
and then there are the other cases like the NPS, or like let's say cases in which customers are not particularly happy or something is broken down, where I think it's a absolute cold call.
Hmm. Hmm. And how long are these calls lasting for you? Are they a few minutes? Are they, 30? Yeah.
So I think again there's like multiple types in which this call could actually pan out.
Hmm.
There's also a focus about like let's say us trying to convert the customer to like let's say the Zoom call from the phone call itself, if
Uh,
it's possible,
got it.
right? Because us understanding how they're using our product is extremely important to us, and that cannot happen over a phone. But having said
Correct.
that, still in a majority of cases, these tend to last anywhere between like half an hour, uh, like or some of them have even gone till like I would say north of an hour as well.
Got it. Wow. Okay. So you call these people. Sometimes they expect your call. Sometimes they don't, and then you talk to them. Sometimes you try to transition them. Hey, can we do a more structured user interview over Zoom? But other times you're like, hey, I've gotten you right here. Why don't you answer a few questions about your challenges or the
So
problem that
again,
you had with it?
start those calls by asking them about their problems so that they are sort of incentivized in the sense that they're able to find an outlet or like they're able to find a way to solve their problem. So usually
Mm-hmm,
there is a fair bit of time that goes into that. And once
mm-hmm,
we've made some amount of progress in solutioning for their problem, is where we then sort of transition the conversation from like, let's say, let's deal with your problems to like, let's say more of a open-ended user research sort of a call.
mm. Oh, so you're basically saying, hey, I'm going to try to solve your problem. And then you
Right.
try to solve that and you try to probably include your support team. And then you say, now that I've solved your problem, why don't we
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your experience and what other specific, like, is it more specific to like why why did you get into these problems, or more about general about how does
No, the
how does the
research is
product, yeah.
quite generic actually.
Oh, wow. So you transition from let's solve your problem to
So we're buying
actually
that
asking them.
credibility from the user.
Wow. Okay. So this is mostly like transitioning support calls and like helpful calls into user research. That is very unique. And doing it as a scale of what you folks are doing at Razorpay, that is um that is very impressive.
No, I mean,
Um
completely scaled
yeah,
up, but it's an experiment that's working so far.
that's great. And now you're doing those through Marvin, so you're actually able to record these calls. Um and is it just designers doing it? Is it product? Whose responsibility is it to do these?
Whoever sets their eyes on the problem first, to be very honest.
Okay, so you basically are like, oh, somebody had a problem with it, this product. We got a bad NPS score, or somebody said they were not happy. Whoever gets there, like, okay, well, I'm gonna put a stake in the ground and say, I'm gonna go and like talk to this person. Um, and
But
it could
usually
be product,
the
yeah.
product manager and the designer because they have more context about the product and the use case itself. So it's usually
Mm-hmm.
them.
Okay. And are people like, sometimes people must be really upset sometimes when you call them? How do you, or are they just happy that you called?
It's actually more of the second
Okay.
because, like, we operate primarily in the world of finances where like
Right.
failure tends to be costly,
Uh-huh.
and the resolution expectancy is almost immediate, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like there are a lot of like non-critical cases in which like support really takes like great care of all those cases, but there are
Mm-hmm.
also a lot of cases where the de facto response of most users is just to be able to pick up, talk to a relationship manager and get a problem
Mm-hmm.
resolved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is where, in fact, like a lot of founders who are on our, sort of customer advocacy group right now
Mm-hmm.
have sort of stuck with us because they
Mm-hmm.
found a lot of value in being able to influence our roadmap and
Mm-hmm.
being able to kind of like get their own problem solved
Mm-hmm.
by kind of having that close engagement with us.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, most of these conversations, at least in the first call, started off as like, okay, let me solve your problem sort of calls. But
Mm-hmm.
right now, I think most of the repeat sort of like engaged users are all
Mm-hmm.
basically active participants in research.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very valuable to us because if our core target users are founders of businesses, we can't get
Mm-hmm.
their time and no agency can ever recruit them for us.
Right. So the best way to recruit them is to show interest that we are here to solve your problems. So much
Absolutely.
so, taking it to the extreme of like, I'm going to call you if you have a problem. I'm going to get personally involved. Especially like when you are even at as I said, like the scale that you are operating, to be able to do that is amazing. but this is definitely possible when you're early in like the product life cycle, when you have, a few hundred or, 10 users.
Right, right. I think this is an experiment again. The caveat to it is like the scalability is still a major concern.
Mm-hmm.
And we are running it in one of our business units that's fairly 0 to 1. And, we're still figuring out the product market fit. There aren't that many users,
Oh,
right? Right.
got it.
But
Okay.
if I had to implement the same experiment in our most scaled up sort of product, in our 10 to 100 sort of a product, I'm not
Mhm.
sure the same approach would actually work. But
Okay.
actually, I think we've been running some experiments and it's working. It's just not scalable.
Hmm. Not scalable. Okay. All right. So it works really well for across the board, but especially from 0 to 1, when you're initially kind of launching a new product, having empowering designers and product managers to like, just go call people when they have problems, and they will be your champions, your advocates, and your research participants for life,
Right.
is for me is the big takeaway from here. That is super super helpful. I think we are several minutes over on this call, but this is one of the most insightful conversations I've ever had. Thank you. This Abhinav, this has been amazing, and I am so glad. This is one of the you guys have built amazing user-centric culture, and you've obviously empowered your design team to go above and beyond, and that is why Razorpay is so successful. So kudos to you and the leadership team at Razorpay, and
In
thank you
global,
for
thank
sharing your
you
thoughts with us today.
and Marvin as well, Prayag, because I think a major part of establishing, this sort of culture is also down to the fact that we had the right tool and infrastructure in place. So thanks a lot to both you and Chirag. So I think you folks have been absolutely wonderful in just like our own journey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So thank you folks for joining. We'll hopefully be able to distribute the recording. If you want to talk about the infrastructure and your user research processes, please reach out to us. My email is prayag@heymarvin.com. If you want to talk more with Abhinav about his processes, feel free to reach out to him. Is that okay, Abhinav?
Yeah,